Thank you for joining us. So everyone probably knows that it's Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. So here we have Raul, and we're very happy that you're here, especially because by being here, you're like being a part of the community and like remembrance. So Raul is going to share a story, and I don't want to take anything away. So here he goes.
Well, good afternoon. Nice to be here with you. And today we observe the Holocaust Memorial Day. It's the Shoah Genocide Awareness Week. And its relevance has really not changed in the past 75 years. It will never change. This year, January 27, I participate with 120 Holocaust survivors in the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I was joined by our daughter, Orna, and granddaughter, Nava. She's 2 years old. I'm sorry I cannot share with you the photograph, but we were walking through Auschwitz, and Nava, 2-year-old, stopped innocently in front of a large photo taken at Auschwitz during the war. On the photograph, there were grandmothers, mothers, and children on the way to the gas chambers. The contrast was incredible to see my little granddaughter jumping around, and on the poster, kids on the way to be gassed. And close by, there was a testimony by a Jewish inmate. His name was Leon Greenman. And this was his testimony. We were bullied out of the train and stood waiting. A truck arrived near us. On the truck, there were women and children. And the center, my wife, was standing up with our baby. A picture I will never forget. They were on the way to undress and then to the gas chambers. 2 hours later, all these people were ashes, including my wife and my baby. I was again and again horrified to think on how many scenarios like those occurred if I would have been there with my grandchildren, my Jewish family. They would have been also gassed and burned. My grandparents on my mother's side perished during the Holocaust, and my wife's family in Poland completely wiped out. They all perished. I would like to share with you a few things that I believe are very important. We are talking a lot about the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And I think it's important to know that. I think Jared heard me mentioning this before, but I think it's extremely important to know why people hate Jews. But before I mention this, I would like to share with you the fact that in 1935, the Nazis passed 3 laws. One of was the Reich citizenship law. The second was the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. And the third law was the law for the protection of the genetic health of the German people. it's important to know this, because this has not been repeated anywhere else in the history of humankind, that between 1933 and 1940, more than 1,400, I repeat, 1,400 anti-Jewish laws were passed in Germany. And it was they were considered pandemic, and no pun intended here, and ultimately resulted in the destruction of Europe's Jews. The background was anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism. Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus Christ, although the Romans, ironically, accused the Jews in Palestine at that time, the Roman Palestina, they accused the Jews of having joined Christianity. The racial anti-Semitism, that Jews are genetically inferior. As a matter of fact, some studies, large studies were done in Europe looking at the genetic traits of disease, and it turns out that the Northern Europeans have more genetic inherited disease than the Ashkenazi Jews that came from that area. That's the irony. There is the economic anti-Semitism. All Jews are rich. And political anti-Semitism. The Nazis considered all Jews to be communists, and when the communists came to power in the USSR, they accused the Jews of being bourgeois and deported them to Siberia. By the way, nobody ever returned from Siberia. All the Jews that were deported to Siberia perished there. So they came out of the concentration camp and then ended up in the Siberian Gulag. 1.5 million children died, Jewish children died during World War II. Only about 5% of Jewish children under Nazi occupation survived the war. Only 5% of the Jewish kids under Nazi occupation survived the war. And so I was very lucky. I was born in a small place, and a slave labor place in a village that was transformed into a slave labor concentration camp called Bershat, Transnistria. Transnistria is currently in western Ukraine, and it's a region, its territory that was given to Romania in exchange for them joining Nazi Germany to fight on the Russian front. And the Romanian, Ukrainian, and surrounding countries sent many Jews there for one purpose only, to ultimately die. So they were either killed, mass shootings, and by the way, to this day, they don't know how many Jews were shot and buried there in massive graves. And you probably heard of the Patrick Dubois, a Catholic priest that was in charge of the Vatican, his relations with the Jewish communities around the world. I met him. He's a wonderful man, and he's committed to find out all the mass graves in Ukraine, and he published 2 books. One of them is called The Holocaust by Bullets, and it has some significance because what happened there during World War II is the Germans were under the soldiers were under strict orders not to use more than 1 single bullet per person. So when the people were buried, each of them had a bullet. So he's going around and asking from village to village where were the mass graves. And he hired a bunch of people with metal detectors, and they collect the bullets and from the ground, and by counting them, they know how many people were buried at each location. He formed an organization called Yachad Unum. Yachad in Hebrew means together, and Unum is together in Latin, and committed to this. He also recently published a 2nd book, totally committed to this thing. I was born in this, my parents were deported to this region, to Bershad, very close to a place called Vinnytsia. Vinnytsia, Transnistria, was Western Ukraine now, was where the Nazis built for Hitler a bunker. It was called the Hitler's East Front headquarters, codenamed Werewolf. The place where I was born was only about 2 hours by car from that place. Now, close by was a city called Vinnytsia, or at the time more than half of the population in town was Jewish. The Einsatzgruppen, the Dead Squad group, was in charge with cleaning up all these locations, and they killed all the Jews in Vinnytsia. You probably seen a photograph, which is at every single Holocaust museum, of a Jewish man dangling his feet into a grave, and a Nazi officer with a revolver at his head, and that on the back of that photograph was written "The Last Jew in Vinnytsia." What the Germans did then went to the local hospitals and they asked if there are any Jews there, and they killed all the Jews there. But was most horrendous, they went to the maternity hospital. They asked for the mothers in labor. They killed all the mothers in labor. And then they asked, are there any Jewish babies? So the nurses showed them where the Jewish babies were. So they took all the Jewish babies, threw them in a sack, tied a sack, and threw them from the 3rd floor of the hospital in the street like unwanted kittens. So I was born there in 43 in that place called Bershad, who, by the way, also used to be a Jewish village prior to World War II. And it was known in Europe as being the capital of Talitot, the prayer shawls, the talises. So they specialized in that village to make prayer shawls. About 21,000 people were driven there to work on a freeway that the Germans were building, Durchstrasse D, the fourth freeway, one of the first freeways in the world that was supposed to link the Germany to the Russian Ural. The ultimate scope was for the Germans to extract all the goodies from Ural and then transfer them to Germany. Bershad was also known for being the command center for the Einsatzgruppen D, the fourth death squad under the command of the infamous Otto Ohlendorf. Otto Ohlendorf was the main defendant at the Nuremberg trials, personally responsible for the murder of 90,000 people. Just imagine, he was a highly educated individual. Actually, he had 2 doctor's degrees and used to insist that people call him doctor, and his name. He had a doctorate degree for law that he obtained in Pavia in Italy, near Siena, and then a doctor in economics. He considered himself a genius in economics, and also in the economics of murders, since he murdered 90,000 people. I was born there when my parents got there, and the slaves were living in half-abandoned farmhouses, and I actually was born in a barn, and it was a very difficult delivery. It was a bridge delivery. When I came out with the feet, which is very complicated delivery. And they told me later it was a very difficult delivery, but I made it. This later on probably inspired me to become an obstetrician and specializing in high-risk obstetrics. From that barn, my parents moved into a half-abandoned village house with other 20 people. And every day a number of people were supposed to report for work on the freeway. And whoever could not work got shot, got killed. To conceal my being there, they kept a small pillow over my head. So I was taught early on not to cry, and they told me that rarely, if ever, did I cry. In the camp, there were people collaborating with the partisans. In the area, you probably heard about the Jewish partisans in the Ukraine. There were movies done about that. And somehow, the Germans, the Nazis, the death squad found out that there were people in the camp collaborating with the partisans and informing them about the movements of the death squads. So they somehow suspected that a brother and a sister were involved with transferring this information to the partisans. And what they did, they took them both in custody, and they tortured the girl in front of her brother until he broke, and he gave them the list of the people in the camp that were collaborating with the partisans. The death squads took out the people to execution, the one that were collaborators. And among them, excuse me, among them, my father. And my father, the execution took place on the local cemetery, the Jewish cemetery. And my father had the intuition when he came there, he saw dead bodies all over. So he fell to the ground and pretended to be dead. And that's how he escaped that. The guards were under the command of a young Romanian Nazi. His name was Raul. And for his pastime, he used to catch Jewish men wherever he would catch them and tie them to his motorcycle and drag them behind the motorcycle. That was his entertainment. My father had to endure this once, and he survived. Both my parents survived the camp. Incidentally, at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, there is a document that the partisans gave my father for his working with them, collaborating with them during the war. And there is also the refugee card at Yad Vashem, on which my name appears. That was my birth certificate. So and there is Raul on the refugee certificate that my father got. The conditions there were horrendous. Out of the 21 to 25 people, 25,000 people that were interned there and did slave work, only about 5,000 survived. And immediately after the war, many of them died of disease. The people were not fed there. The only time they will feed them is when they worked on the freeway, on the Durkstrasse. And they would be given a cup of soup and a small piece of bread for an entire work on the freeway. And horrendous conditions. If you ever been to Ukraine or to Russia during spring and winter, the temperature is below zero. So people were dying there, either freezing to death, being shot to death because they couldn't work, or of hunger. After the war, we returned. The camp was liberated by the Red Army, and the soldiers were, the Red Army soldiers were under strict orders not to allow any of the refugees to come on the trucks. But my mother, who was fluent in Russian, she was trained as a concert pianist, and she gave some concerts before and after the war. And she was fluent in Russian. She was able to convince the soldiers on one truck to allow my father, her, and myself to be on the truck and get to the first train station. And while on the truck, one of the soldiers felt sorry for me and pulled out a small piece of chocolate and gave it to me. My mother gave me that piece of chocolate, put it close to my mouth, but I spit it out because I never had solid food before. So all the soldiers burst in laughter, and they told my parents, don't worry, he will grow up and become a big commander in the Red Army. So since my mother was a musician, she never missed a beat. And she replied, no, my son will become a doctor. And I heard that story so many times that I had no choice but to become a doctor. When we got to the first station, train station, the name of the place was Mogilev. By the way, they have a big Holocaust memorial there because many Jews there were killed. It was a distribution center for slaves. But from there was a train going to the town where my parents, from where my parents were deported, called Chernovitz. And again, the soldiers did not allow anybody to get into the wagons, but people were allowed to, the refugees, to go on the roofs of the train. So just imagine my mother with a 1-year-old toddler in her hands and on the roof of the train. And I used to have for years nightmares that I'm falling off the roof of that train, actually into my adult life. So we got to Chernovitz, and there was no welcome home. The parents were not allowed, like all the other Jews, were not allowed to get into their original homes. They were told, these homes belong now to the people. I don't know if you've seen the movie Dr. Zhivago. There was a similar scene there in that movie. And they started deporting a lot of the Jews to Siberia. So my parents ran away into Romania. So it's a long story from there on. So I'm open to questions if you have any questions.
Raul, do you mind sharing the story about your first time in America in New York?
Yes. So when we got to Romania, my parents attempted to immigrate to the States. My mother had 5 brothers in America that came here before World War I. And it took a long time to get permission to leave Romania. So after 10 years, we were able to come to the States. And City College, I was almost finished with my high school in Romania, and City College was willing to accept me as a student. But one day we walked on Madison Avenue, and then of one of the streets on Madison Avenue, actually I have a photograph of that place, on the door of a small restaurant, there was a wooden plaque, and on the plaque was inscripted, no dogs, no Negroes, no Jews. 1960, New York. So my parents said, we're out of here. So we moved to Israel. And we got to Israel. In Israel, they didn't want to recognize my high school from Romania. They said, you have to finish high school here. So as I shared with Hannah, my biggest academic accomplishment in Israel and in life was to finish high school in Israel in a year and a half. I barely knew how to read. And so then I had military service there, where I met my future wife. We had 3 children, and we have 3 children and 8 grandchildren. I finished medical school in Israel, worked in Israel as a physician, then came here for advanced training and the the opportunities and offers that were made to me were very difficult to turn down. So we stayed here, but we frequently go to Israel, and we still have relatives there. Any other?
I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for telling your story. I heard it in the summer at Kala, but I just appreciate it. Also, I know you didn't grow up in the camp and you were very young at the time, but I was wondering, like, what encouraged you? Like, how did you learn so much about it? Like, who did you go to, and like, what was that like to learn about your history and the history of your parents there?
Well, interestingly, my mother, there was not a single day that she didn't talk about the horrible experience that they had there in the camp. And then my father, totally the opposite. He never liked to talk about it. But my mother, she was quite young when she came with my father to the camp. She was 21. And the sufferings were beyond belief. What she always shared with me, that it was not the beating and the hard work that was very rough, but the most difficult thing to endure was hunger. It was freezing cold, but hunger, more than anything else, was the most horrific thing that they had to endure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Question. What was it like after you, like when you got liberated, what was it like trying to adjust back into like society again? Was it like difficult because like you were used to a certain way of life, and then, you know?
What would that be? Well, when I came out of the camp, I was a year old, so there are very few things that I still recall. But life for me was like for any other child in that part of the world, Jewish child. I experienced anti-Semitism quite early. In the grammar school, I already experienced anti-Semitism. Kids used to call me Christ killer. So, you know, anti-Semitism is coming here. And since I was an educator for many years, medical educator, also a professor at university, over time, I also committed myself to Holocaust education, because the vast majority of the people hear the word Holocaust, but they really don't know what it means. And they do hear about anti-Semitism, but they don't identify the elements of anti-Semitism. So I think you should be aware of this, and unfortunately you will continue to encounter that. And we should never keep quiet. On college campuses, it's unbelievable. Here in Los Angeles, UCLA probably more than any other institution in the country.
Was it hard for you to like keep track of your identity, I guess, as you moved from country to country, considering like you spent your life, or like a good portion of your life at least, in Romania, Israel, and in America?
Well, I always had an accent in every single language I spoke. So people, usually after I introduce myself, they would ask me, "Where are you from?" So no, Actually, I learned quickly to adapt to every possible situation. And this helped me also in my career because I specialized in taking care of pregnant women with medical and surgical complications and dealt with emergencies nonstop. So, and one of the greatest rewards for me was actually a few months ago. I do give lectures at the Holocaust Museum here and also the Simon Wiesenthal Museum. And one African-American young woman came after my lecture and she said, "Can I give you a hug?" So I said, "Well, what's that for?" So I say, "You delivered my mother, you delivered me." So that was very special. And she said, "And not only did you deliver me, at that time my mother didn't have medical insurance and didn't have money to pay, and you said, never mind." So my residence and training that I taught medicine and so on, when I retired, they tried to figure out how many babies did I deliver during my career, and they thought at least 3,000. Okay. So
I have a question.
Sure.
So have you returned to your birthplace since?
Yes, actually the first time was about 5 years ago, and I'm sorry I cannot share with you any of my slides, but the place probably didn't change since World War II. It looks like a half abandoned village with ruined farmhouses. Strangely enough, a small structure of one-story building that used to be the local synagogue, which was built in the 1800s. It's still standing there. And they preserved inside whatever they had, you know, benches and what was the Torah, at the time there were two Jewish people left in town when I visited the place, and they are still taking care of the synagogue. The cemetery is totally, it's devastated, the Jewish cemetery. And you drive, the drive from Chernovitz from there took a whole day, like 10 hours or so. And the villages and in the middle of nowhere, actually nowhere. It's far away from any place that you can imagine. We went and we also visited Vinica, and the place where the werewolf, about 2 hours from my birthplace, and it's a nice small Ukrainian town. We went to the forest where the bunker was, and when the Germans retreated, they blew up that bunker, and to this day there are literally tons of concrete there of the bunker. But Bershat itself, the place where I was born, it's like, I don't know, not third world, fourth world place, you know, abandoned village homes, destroyed, and surrounded by fields for miles, corn fields, corn and potato. And, that's it.
Thank you so much, Raul.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, feel free
Thank you.
to contact me.
Thank
And
you.
thank you. Thank you for listening in.